Hello, everyone. This is Bill Griffin. Welcome to Different Take Podcast. If you like this content, please subscribe, like, share, comment. Really appreciate you watching. New episodes Tuesdays and Thursdays. Today I'm continuing the second part of some clips I played. Two different gentlemen, one Republican, one Democrat, running for Georgia State House of Representative, District 110 in Lawrenceville, Georgia. If you don't live in Georgia, this still will, I think you'll find very informative. The second part is a little lengthier. I'll play clips of folks or the gentleman answering the same questions, pretty much the same questions on different topics. So you can compare, contrast the candidates. I'll provide some commentary. The two candidates are Greg Kennard, G-R-E-G-G Kennard, and Zachary Procter, P-R-O-C-T-E-R, Zach Procter. Mr. Procter is the Republican candidate and Mr. Kennard is a Democrat candidate. And I'll go ahead and get to it. The first topic I'm going to play for you is Mr. Kennard answering the question, does climate change pose existential threat to humanity?
In my mind, there's no question. And that's why I've been working diligently as part of the Energy Committee and part of the Motor Vehicle Committee to really push and accelerate the electrification of Georgia with EVs, the EV industry, and the infrastructure to sponsor that. So I'm hoping in the next 10 years, Georgia is going to be a real leader in that, and that will impact the economy in so many ways with jobs and the manufacturing new vehicles, as well as help us assist us with the climate.
It's kind of how big a recession do we want to have? Because if it's true, you couldn't have the price of gas high enough, right? Does that make sense?
It hasn't slowed anybody down. People are still traveling. They're on the roads. So they haven't felt the pain to the point where it's really stopping any consumer spending. However, that's short-lived. It will at some point bring it to a grinding halt. But in my mind, we should have already been there. I mean, the fact that we have slow walked the electrification. And
so Mr. Kennard says, in my mind, we should have already been there. Well, there's a cost to that. And to do this nationwide or in Georgia, you're talking about people losing their job due to slowing economy. You can't, the old saying, you can't have your cake and eat it too. That seems pretty obvious. That's my opinion. The idea that the government just spends money and there's jobs, it's not, there's downside to that kind of thing. And this is Mr. Kennard talking about charging stations to kind of illustrate that.
And I think in the next 10 years, we're going to go from just a couple of thousand electrical charging stations to upwards of 20,000. And so we're looking at putting them in everywhere you can buy gas now. So grocery stores, convenience stores, you'll also see an electric charging station or several of them.
So to get there in 10 years, as he says, or to have already been there would have been a cost. And that typically politicians don't like quantifying cost. And they don't. It's just something that the electorate sort of feels that it's necessary and it may not be logical. On the other hand, it may be logical. I'm not saying Mr. Kennard's thinking about this emotionally, but there's a cost. And in order to make a decision, you ought to have it quantified. What the effects of all of this infrastructure building he's talking about, and you see that at the federal level, that it's not explained very well. This is Mr. Procter on the same
methods. Right now, we're building Plant Vogtle. We've been building Plant Vogtle for a long time, and looks like we're going to be building Plant Vogtle for a while longer. It's the only nuclear power plant currently under construction in the United States. There was a lot of scare that was spread around the country about nuclear power back from the 60s through the 80s. And it turned out that a lot of what people were scared of simply was not actually an issue. Nuclear power is the cleanest, most efficient, cheapest form of energy production that we currently have access to. We need a lot more of it in this country, and we can lead the way in Georgia by completing that plant and showing exactly what a benefit that really is.
Mr. Procter is exactly right. That's where things are going. And by the time the price of gas goes up and the pain economically that a lot of people have to feel, especially you see this through the policies of the Biden administration, at some point in time, nuclear that's going to be the option, and it takes a long time to build these facilities. And you could very easily say to Mr. Kennard, the way you get there is nuclear, and if you wanted to be there already, that's the way the state would have gone. If you're looking back and saying, well, things should have gone one way or the other. The thing is, Mr. Proctor's on the right side of this. I think the threat to humanity, it's not proven how imminent this threat is, if it exists. And he's correct. Nuclear power is the way to go. To, I think, Mr. Kennard's credit, he does say that inflation's a bad thing. I've often said on this channel that if you really believed climate change was an existential threat to humanity, then you couldn't have the price of fossil fuels high enough, that energy source. You couldn't have it high enough because if lots of people are going to die because of climate change, which is what threat to humanity means, then you couldn't have the price high enough. Of course, logic would tell you a lot of people might starve to death, but he does not think inflation's a good thing, Mr. Kennard. This is Mr. Proctor, the Republican, on the subject of abortion.
I'm happy with the heartbeat bill, which was passed in the last term. I think that Georgia is in a good place now that the Dobbs decision has come down and the heartbeat law has been allowed.
And this is Mr. Kennard on the same question.
Georgia has kind of hit that middle spot of 20 weeks that we see as viable, that someone could, before 20 weeks, a woman could terminate their pregnancy if they felt to do so. Now with the Supreme Court ruling last week, we're going to see probably the heartbeat bill implemented.
Now, some people may hear this and hear why disagreement between these two gentlemen. I don't see that at all. Mr. Kennard clearly believes, his words, that the unborn child's life deserves protection. He says that protection, he's comfortable with it starting at 20 weeks, and he struggles with this question. Mr. Proctor is fine with heartbeat bill, which you're talking about 2 weeks or so difference, 8 weeks or something like that, maybe even a little farther, but they both believe that an unborn child deserves protection. This is diametrically opposed to a lot of people on the left to say, particularly Stacey Abrams, who's running for governor, a Democrat, who has been very clear that there should be no legal protections for the unborn child. The mother has a right to terminate pregnancy at any point in time until a child's born. And there's debate in California that they should even go past birth. This idea that these two gentlemen are diametrically opposed to each other compared to Stacey Abrams just isn't true. This is Mr. Kennard's answer to the question, should the state of Georgia subsidize abortions? The state government subsidizing abortions. What do you think of that?
I'm not familiar with it. I know Georgia doesn't do it.
Right. But I mean, would you be in favor of such a thing or comfortable with that?
Look at that more deeply. Honestly, I don't have anything to draw from to give you an educated.
I was disappointed that Mr. Kennard couldn't answer his question. It's not a difficult question. It doesn't require a lot of study. You either believe that the state should fund abortions or they shouldn't. But he says he's never thought about it. And a state legislator issue important as this to a lot of people should have gave it some thought, should have an answer, in my opinion. This is Mr. Proctor, going through these issues as quickly as I can. This is Mr. Proctor, but also to do it properly, I hope. Please comment if you don't think I pulled this off in the correct way or have any criticisms. This is Mr. Procter on the idea of state income taxes.
Absolutely. I want to do away with state income tax. I believe that, like Tennessee, Florida, and Texas, we would be better off with a consumption-based tax. The best thing about that, you keep more of your paycheck, you get to decide where you spend it. And really, the best thing about the whole thing, all the drug dealers that I see coming through court, they pay as much taxes as everybody else when we have a consumption tax. Right now, they're not paying a penny in income tax because they're not reporting any of it, but they are spending it. And when they spend it, they're going to have to pay sales tax. So they'd be paying the same rate as everybody else.
There's also the IRS, the tax code is so complicated. You can't complete your Georgia return without doing your federal return. It seems like you'd have a happier populace if you didn't have to deal with filling out a return.
Absolutely. That would relieve a lot of stress every year for a lot of Americans. I definitely would be in favor of a flatter, simpler tax code.
So, Mr. Procter, Republican, favors a consumption tax for the state of Georgia. And I think he makes a great point. I spoke with Mr. Kennard about this. You can find the clip if you want to look it up, but it's a very brief thing. I'll just relay it. That he prefers status quo. I think Georgia's at 5.75% income tax. Democrats, for whatever reason, don't like consumption tax. I don't get it, but that's what they favor. Democrats really like income, and some Republicans do like income tax because they can manipulate the tax code for vote buying schemes, whereas the consumption tax is fair. It doesn't. You're not favoring one sector or one donor class, campaign donor class over another one. So I think Florida and Texas have something there, and the United States ought to emulate it a lot, and people would be a lot happier about it, and you wouldn't have to hire tens of thousands of IRS agents. This is Mr. Kennard and I talking about the COVID shutdowns and whether there was a benefit. And in this question, I'm specifically asking, the benefit is how many lives are saved? Is there any proof at this point in time, looking back from today in September 2022 back to March 2020, is there any benefit, a quantifiable benefit? And this was his response. Benefit was because the shutdowns had a serious cost. So people are looking at it
I think we would
for the next one and going, well, does it make sense to do that again? How do you determine that?
the loss of life would have been greater if we had not had some level of shutdown. Just on the front end, we did shelter in place for a while in Georgia and other states across the country and other nations across the world. They did longer lengths of that, and I think it was necessary.
Was the quantifiable benefit? Do you think the citizens are owed that?
Yeah, and I think we have some scientists and medical experts who have answered that. They were saying if we don't do something, this is what the numbers will be. And we've had some real, I watched the news during that time, just like you, I'm sure, and there were charts saying this is how we can slow the spread and save lives. And if we don't take certain steps, will be the exponential numbers if we don't do so.
I don't necessarily believe Mr. Kennard was trying to be evasive in this, but my question is, looking back, not an estimate at 2020. We all saw what the estimate was. Was there a benefit? Were there going to be any lives saved due to these drastic policies of shutting down the economy? Because if the logic is that there was, and it is, into Mr. Kennard's mind, even though he can't quantify it, and the population ought to, in my opinion, deserves an answer as what the quantifiable benefit is in order to determine whether you do enact these policies again. And our legislators, Mr. Kennard, does not, he's not for, or I should say he was in favor of these shutdowns, thought they were a good thing. Many Democrats believe that, but no one Dr. Fauci on down, no one has expressed what a quantifiable benefit. What does that mean? An estimate of lives, what lives were saved. Because you could just as well say that the shutdowns killed more people than the shutdowns saved. And this is Mr. Procter on this.
But my feeling on it is that we made a mistake in deciding to shut everybody down. What we should have done instead was identify who was at the greatest risk, who was immunocompromised, and quarantine them while the virus burned itself out through the rest of the pop. Keep that in mind next time.
Do you think the counties ought to have the power to impose these restrictions on their own?
Well, again, I don't like it, but I have to be consistent. I do want to see decisions made at the most local level possible. And so while I understand the governor making the prohibition against forcing masks upon people at the county level.
So I think Mr. Procter is against shutdowns, but it should be decided at the local level. So if a county wants to shut their population down and impose all these restrictions, then that's going to be a campaign issue. And for a lot of people, they need to understand this if that's the way this is going to go about. I think what's going to happen is always going to be central control. And even though I tend to agree with Mr. Procter, people ought to vote for the local politicians that will do the smart things, that this will be taken out of the local politicians' hands, and they'll want it taken out of their hands because they don't want to get blamed. They want credit, but not the blame. So that's just politics. And this is Mr. Kennard on the role of the Georgia state government in regards to mental health.
We passed HB 1013, the Mental Health Parity Act, which is going to change Georgia going forward. It's going to take a few more months to get it implemented. But, before the Mental Health Parity Act, and still it's a reality, the largest mental health service provider in our state is Georgia State Prisons. We have criminalized mental health, and most of the people locked up in our state prisons and county jails suffer from mental illness. They're not criminals, they're sick.
So Mr. Kennard makes a very good point, common sense. Mental health there's a correlation between that and crime committed. And he makes his point by saying, hey, prison population's high. This is Mr. Procter, the Republican, on the same.
We've got a lot of metro counties that are decriminalizing marijuana, which there are pluses and minuses to that. But we are sending a message, even just with marijuana, that maybe drugs aren't that bad. We've got a huge epidemic of fentanyl flowing into this country, which is extraordinarily dangerous. It can get people hooked very quickly. It can kill people very quickly. Well, you've got dealers out there who are taking lighter drugs like marijuana, and they're lacing it with these methamphetamines, with fentanyl, because it gets them a bigger high and it is addictive. And that means they're going to have repeat customers. And you've got people who are ODing because they don't know that they are inhaling fentanyl when they're lighting a joint. End up having to prosecute a crime against them because a criminal conviction is the only way to force them to get treatment. And even then, they can only really force them to get outpatient treatment because there is not a long-term residential mental health.
So on the subject of the state of Georgia supporting mental health, making some changes in their laws, and got to get in all the details, but these men seem to agree upon this, the Democrat and Republican. So maybe if that's any indication, maybe the legislature will enact some policies that solve some of these problems with crime and also the lack of hospitals for folks with serious mental health issues and reduce homelessness and that sort of thing. So this is Mr. Procter on public education.
Well, if you want to identify systemic racism, look at failing schools. People who are insisting that we've got to maintain the course the way public education has been done, they're the ones who are perpetuating a system in which poor children of color are unable to get ahead because they're not getting the level of education that will allow them to advance, allow them to claw their way out of poverty. And they're saying, nope, we are keeping them in there because that's the only way to do it. If we allow those kids to be able to find the best fit possible for them, that is going to open doors to mobility among society that will cure so.
This is Mr. Kennard answering a question about voting by mail. I have an issue with this. I think a lot of people do, and the fact that voting by mail there is no assurance it can be done in confidence, meaning the act of filling out the ballot cannot be done. There's no assurance that that will be done in secrecy. Democrats don't seem to have a problem with this. I think it's because they perceive they'll get some sort of advantage. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I think. This is what Mr. Kennard has to say about voting by mail and particularly voting in secret. Is it unreasonable for citizens to believe that voting ought to be done in secret? Is that unreasonable?
What do you mean by in secret?
Meaning in total confidence.
Okay, so not at a election office, not at a voting precinct, in public?
No. That's my voting experience when I first started voting was in total secrecy. There was a clause. You pulled a curtain and nobody knew who you voted for.
Well, the last few times I've voted in Gwinnett County, there are petitions between the voting.
Right, but that you can't. There's no guarantee of being able to do that when you vote by mail. So if you get a ballot in the mail, there's it arrives at your house, and you might not ever. It's possible you may never even see the ballot.
Mhm.
Or somebody wants to observe you vote. All right, it could be anybody, your dad, your mom, neighbor, whomever, your pastor, whoever.
I've never understood that to be an issue that I've ever even thought about.
So I think you can see by Mr. Kennard's answer, he's perfectly fine with voting by mail, doesn't understand or feigns ignorance at the question, frankly, that this is a problem. Well, it's something you can't prove. It's unknowable how many people would cede their vote or sell their vote because they get the ballot in the mail. It would be impossible to prosecute. So a lot of Democrats and folks on the left, especially the farther left you go, the more resistance there is to this concept that, well, people will vote. The convenience of voting is far more important than whether people could trust the outcome or trust whether the person whose name's on the ballot actually even voted. This is Mr. Proctor's view on the same topic. In person.
I definitely think that this was a good step in the right direction. I would love to see more in-person voting. So I think that we should go back to having to show some kind of cause in order to get a mail ballot. I don't think any other, and we need to figure it out.
It seems to me it would be that whichever side loses has confidence that they legitimately lost. It seems that to me is far more important than convenience or whether or not
Yes.
you stood in line for, an hour or something. What do you think?
I joked years ago that eventually we're going to see a situation where somebody sues for having lost an election because it hurt their feelings. And I think we're getting dangerously close.
I think Mr. Proctor's position on this is correct. I'm probably beating a dead horse, but the idea of voting by mail, I asked Mr. Kennard We're just destroying the concept called respect the sanctity or protect the sanctity of the secret ballot, because people would vote in confidence. You went to a voting booth and no one knew who you voted for, and you were mandated to do that. And now if you can request a ballot in the mail, and in many states they just send the ballots out in the mail under the principle of, well, it's more important that you get your vote, no matter if you what you do with that vote. In other words, you could give it to another person, you could have them observe you, you could seed it, you're also being subject to harassment. Your family member can say, hey, I want to watch you vote. You're going to vote this way, I'm going to watch you do it. So you're subject to harassment, intimidation, so forth and so on. So those are the topics I went through with these gentlemen. I'm sure there's a lot of other issues that we could have talked about, but those are the key issues of the day. And each interview at the end, I always ask, is there anything else you want to add? So I appreciate your watching. I hope you found it informative. Please comment if on this, particularly criticism. I'd like to hear some, if I've done anything wrong here. But those are the two candidates. It's Greg Kennard and Zachary Procter, District 110 in Georgia House of Representatives, Lawrenceville, Georgia. I think Zach Procter is a better candidate. Probably won't surprise anybody that watches the channel that I would think that, but he seemed far more reasonable on the issues, and I hope you'll vote for him. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, share if you like the content on this channel. Thank you.